This is Greek with David Hutchison. Mood. When we talk about mood, we're talking about how an author is portraying reality. That word portrayal is very important. When an author portrays something as reality, something as actual, the author will use the indicative mood. And when the author is portraying something as potential, he will use one of the other moods, whether it's a subjunctive, or an imperative, or an optative. So mood has to do with how the author is portraying reality. The indicative is the mood of reality or presented reality. You might say assumed reality. The reason we say that it's presented reality or assumed reality is because it's not necessarily reality. Because you can lie in the indicative mood, or you can even make a mistake. The Pharisees say that Jesus is a sinner. They use the indicative mood, but we shouldn't understand that to mean that that's actually real simply because they're using the indicative mood. But the indicative mood does present reality or assume reality, but you have to pay attention to surrounding context to find out whether something is real or unreal. The plain use of the indicative, what you might call the normal or the regular use, is declarative indicative. The author is simply declaring something to be true. It's either true or an assumed truth or something presented as true. In reality, it may or may not be true, but this is how the author is stating it. Philippians 4:19, hare theosmu plerose pasen kreon humon. My God will fulfill all of your needs, your every need. And of course, from context, we know that this one is true. Uk oidaton anthropon. I do not know the man. This one turns out not to be true because this was a disciple denying Jesus, Peter. So your normal use of the indicative is a declarative indicative. Another use of the indicative is called a potential indicative. This is the use of the indicative in a verb that expresses obligation, wish, or desire, and then it will be followed by an infinitive. So the key for this one is the nuance of the verb. In its basic meaning, in its lexical nuances, does the verb express obligation or wish or desire? And then in context, you'll see that infinitive follow. So this is really a subcategory of the declarative indicative, the main normal use, but the key to this one is the type of verb being used plus that infinitive. So here's an example with the verb boulamai. Boulamai un proseukisthai tous andros. I desire the men to pray. So the key is that verb with this wish, desire sort of a sense, plus that infinitive. You can also use the indicative when you're asking a question. And so we would call this an interrogative indicative. This could be a real question where you're seeking information, or simply a rhetorical question. The key here is going to be the question mark, and you may or may not have a questioning word, something we would call an interrogative particle. So here, Matthew 27:11, we have the question mark at the end. Su e ha basileus ton Judaion? Are you the king of the Jews? So that question mark is key. It's probably a good habit to look at the end of clauses and sentences to see what punctuation marks there are. If you don't notice them, you will translate them incorrectly. So without the question mark, this one would be, you are the king of the Jews. But here it's a question, are you the king of the Jews? One interesting feature of Greek is that someone can ask a question and show you the expected answer, by whether they use the particle "u" or "may." So if someone uses "u" in a question, they're expecting a yes answer, an affirmative answer. 1 Corinthians 9:1, Paul says, "Uk eimi apostolos?" Am I not an apostle? I am an apostle, aren't I? This usage of "u" here that tells us that. Now remember, of course, that we have "u" can sometimes become "uk" with a kappa or "uk" with a key, depending on the words that follow, so it's all forms of "u." If the author uses the negative "may," he's expecting a negative answer, such as 1 Corinthians 12:30. "Me pantes glossais lalusin." All do not speak in tongues, do they? And the answer he's expecting is, well, no, of course they don't. Why is that the case? Because Paul said that God gave different gifts to different people as he wills. So against those who would suggest that speaking in tongues is a sign for every Christian, Scripture clearly says that that is not the case. You can also use the indicative in a conditional sentence. We'll explore these more thoroughly later in the semester, but I do want to point out now that you can use the indicative in a conditional sentence. It will be accompanied by the particle "a," that word "if." "A estin soma sukikon, estin kai pneumatikon." If there is a physical body, there is also a spiritual body. So we'll get into all the nuances of these conditional sentences later, but one of the ways you'll see an indicative is in a conditional sentence. You can also use the indicative to express a command. You can probably guess that the normal mood used for a command is the imperative mood, but it is possible to use the indicative. Now what will happen here is that you're using the future tense in the indicative mood and you're expressing a command. Almost always these are Old Testament quotations. Sometimes this is called the volative or cohortative. This occurs in Matthew a fair bit, but it's rare elsewhere. That doesn't mean it doesn't occur, just not as common. It does occur, for example, in James, "You will love your neighbor as yourself." But so here's a usage in Matthew 6. "Kai haten proseuchesthe, uk esesthe hos hoi hypocritai." And when you pray, you will not be like the hypocrites. In other words, do not be like the hypocrites. Don't do it. This one's not a quotation of an Old Testament text, but you will very frequently see that use with Old Testament quotations simply because that did occur in the Old Testament. Now for the subjunctive mood. This has been called the mood of probability, something that's uncertain, but it's probable. Now against this idea, one of the new grammars, Intermediate Greek Grammar by Mathewson and Emig, they prefer to talk about this mood as a hypothetical mood or a mood of projection. You will see a good number of subjunctives in the New Testament because subjunctives were increasing in their usage in the first century, while optatives were decreasing. The first one I want to look at is called a hortatory subjunctive. Think about the word exhortation when you think about this one. This is an exhortation or an encouragement to do something. It's usually in the first person plural, although sometimes, rarely, it's first person singular. This is the "let us" idea, such as agape toi, agapomen allelus, beloved, let us love one another. So this "let us" idea, first plural, very rarely first singular, let me do such and such. So think about the word exhortation and let us, and you'll get this one. Another one's called the deliberative subjunctive. Think about the word deliberating. A jury deliberates when they're trying to think and decide about something. So this would be a questioning or deliberating subjunctive. This might be a real question, or it might be a rhetorical question. A real question, they're seeking information. A rhetorical question, often what you're doing with a rhetorical question is you're really calling for a certain behavior. So in Romans 6:15, hamartesumen, hati uk esmin hupanaman ala hupakarid, me genita. So the subjunctive there, should we sin? Shall we sin? Because we're not under law, but under grace? Paul's not seeking information, but he's making a rhetorical point. Should we sin? And he answers with an optative that we'll come to later, me genita, by no means, may it never be, absolutely not. So this is a deliberative subjunctive. There's another use of the subjunctive that's really interesting. This is called a subjunctive of emphatic negation. Here you're going to use ou and may, both negatives, plus a subjunctive, and you are emphatically denying that something will occur. You can use the translation certainly not or by no means. Matthew 5:20, Jesus says, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees, ou me eis elthete, eis tein basilean ton uranon. You will absolutely not enter into the kingdom of heaven. You will absolutely not. And of course, the Pharisees thought themselves pretty righteous. But Jesus says their righteousness isn't the standard that's going to make it. They're in trouble, and of course so are we, unless we have someone else's righteousness imputed to us. The subjunctive can be used as a prohibition. Of course, the imperative mood can do this, but so can the subjunctive mood. So we can just think of this as a negative command. You would have may plus an aorist subjunctive, and you would translate it do not. So Matthew 6:34, me un merimnesete eis tein aurion. Therefore, don't worry about tomorrow. Now, it's probably worth noting when Jesus tells us not to worry about tomorrow and not to worry about things in general, it's not because those things aren't important and maybe even scary or frightful. But the reason we don't worry is because God knows, God is able, and God cares. So we can trust Him rather than trusting in ourselves to handle the future. Part of humility is saying that God is able and I am not, so I will trust you, God. A subjunctive can be used in a conditional clause. Again, this is the if portion. We would call it the protasis of a conditional clause. The subjunctive would go along with the word aeon, and this one expresses a probability or a possibility. 1 John 2:1, aeon tis hamarte, parakleton ekomen proston patera, Iesun Christon dikaion. If anyone sins, we have an advocate, we have a paraclete with the Father, before the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous one. And of course we know that anyone will sin. People do sin. People will sin. The good news is we have an advocate, a righteous advocate, who stands before the Father pleading on our behalf. You can use a subjunctive in a purpose clause. This expresses the purpose or intent of the main verb. You'll often see this with hina or hapos. And so a purpose translation would be something like in order that or so that. 1 John 2:1, that same passage as just before. Tauta grapho human, hina me hamartete. I write these things to you, hina plus subjunctive, so that you don't sin. Now this subjunctive is also negated by may, but it's expressing the purpose of why is John writing, so that you either do something or don't do something. Here he says so that you don't do something. It's a purpose subjunctive that happens to be negated. Now the other side of purpose is result. Purpose is intent, result is what happens. So a subjunctive can express the result of what happens. You could use hina plus the subjunctive for this. Really what you need is to pay attention to context to see if it's purpose or result. So 1 John 1:9, still this same passage, working a little bit backwards. Eon homologomen tas hamartias hemon. If we confess our sins, pistos estin kai dikaios. He is faithful and just. Now here's the hina phrase. Hina aphe hemen tas hamartias. With the result that he will forgive us the sins. He will forgive us the sins. Kai katharise. And cleanse hemos, and cleanse us. Apapases adakias. From all unrighteousness. The result of confessing sins is forgiveness, cleansing, being useful once again. Now sometimes it's possible to have both purpose and result. And so this would be a subjunctive where you understand from context that it's really communicating not only the purpose, not only the result, but both and. So this would be, again, hina plus the subjunctive. So John 3:16 is a good example of this. You know the first part. Let's just pick it up with the hina. Hina pas ha pistuon e sauton me apaletai al eke zoen ionion. So God gave his son why, and with what result? In order that everyone who believes in him should not perish, but have life everlasting, everlasting life. So this is not only the purpose, but this is the result as well. A subjunctive can be used with a hina clause, and this whole clause can act like a noun. So don't think that hina clauses are always purpose clauses, but they could be a noun clause. So here's a good example, John 4:34. Emon broma estin hina poieso ta thelema tu pimpson tasme. My food is, now you could just have a noun. My food is an apple. My food is a pizza. My food is a cheeseburger. But what is the food here? It's introduced by hina plus a subjunctive. So this whole phrase, this whole clause, my food is what? That I do the will of the one who sent me. Subjunctive, introduced by hina, the whole clause acts like a noun. And so anything a noun could do, you could have a hina clause doing the same type of thing, whether it's subject, object, apposition, and you get the point. Subjunctives can be used in an indefinite relative clause, expressing indefiniteness. And some good keywords here are a relative pronoun, plus the word on, plus the subjunctive. It gives us a translation like a whoever. So here in Matthew, you've got hos, the relative pronoun. You've got on, and then you've got the subjunctive. You have a lot of good clues here. Kai hoson thele in human enai protos estai humon doulos. And whoever wants, whoever wishes, or whoever desires to be first among you will be your servant. Relative pronoun plus on plus subjunctive. And another type of indefinite clause, this one is an indefinite temporal clause. You're going to have a temporal adverb or a temporal conjunction. And so here you have an until or whenever idea. 1 Corinthians 11:26. Ton thanaton tu kuriu, katangelete akri hu elthe. You proclaim the death of the Lord until he comes. A temporal adverb plus a subjunctive. So you see that the subjunctive mood can do quite a bit. But the good news there is I think there are a lot of contextual clues, a lot of other words to help you, and you can figure out the possibilities. Now, why would an author use the imperative mood? And again, the point of doing all of this study is to ask the question, so what? Who cares? Why is an author doing this? Well, why are we doing this? It's not simply to put a label on something, but to say, why does an author do this? What is he trying to accomplish? What is he trying to say? So why would an author use an imperative? An author would use an imperative when he's trying to impose his will on someone else. One of the main uses, and probably the first thing you think of with an imperative, is a command. Commanding someone to do something. Usually this is a superior giving a command to an inferior. Now we'll get into tense and aspect later. Aspect has to do with kind of action. But there has been a lot said in the past about aorist imperatives or present imperatives. And some of what was said, research has demonstrated, was not entirely accurate. So we want to be careful with how we say these sorts of things. Remember always that context will help you. So some of the possibilities are not absolute necessities in every context. So an aorist can view things as a whole, kind of as a summary. It doesn't focus on the ongoing nature of a command, but it could focus on this command just from the whole. A present tense can focus on the ongoing process. So when we study this a bit more soon, we're going to say can and may, because there is overlap sometimes between usage. But the present tense can express an ongoing command. Really what you have to do is know what's possible, and then let context help you to find out what's probable. So there's not always a rigid distinction between an aorist command and a present command. So do pay attention to context. 1 Thessalonians 5:16 through 18, several commands here. Pantote kairete, adialeptos proseuchiste, in panti eucharistete. Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, give thanks in everything. So all three of these imperatives are commands. When English speakers think of commands, we often and almost exclusively think of second person, you, you, you. But Greek can use a third person imperative. Sometimes these are translated as let him or let her do such and such, but this let idea in English may suggest that it's permissible or optional, and that's not the idea of a command. So perhaps a better translation than let him or let her would be he must, she must. You may see translations starting to go in this direction. The New Christian Standard Bible, which is a revision of the Holman Christian Standard Bible, has been doing this in some places I've noticed. An imperative can also be a prohibition. This is just a negative command. It's forbidding an action. You'll have may plus the imperative. And as I said just a moment ago about the present and aorist, just pay attention to context for nuances. We'll explore what's possible, and then as you put it into context, let's see what's probable. Me phabu, manan pistue. Do not fear, only believe. So the imperative phabu negated by me. So you can do an imperative as a command, as a prohibition. You can also do it as a request or an entreaty. The key here is we have an inferior who is making a request of a superior. So just because it uses an imperative, you shouldn't think that this person is commanding someone. This often occurs in prayers, and by no means should we think that we are commanding God to do anything, as if we were in charge. An imperative is used in Luke 11, Kyrie, didexon hemas proseukisthai. Lord, teach us to pray. This would be a request or an entreaty. You could even add the word please in some contexts. Another use of an imperative is what we would call an imperative of permission. Here, the superior grants permission for something. It's kind of a subcategory of a command. It really is a command, but the reason you might call it an imperative of permission, the one granting the request permits it, but is not necessarily in favor of it. So you might add the word let or may. 1 Corinthians 7:15, Eide ha apistos choridzetai, choridzesto. But if the unbeliever leaves, let him leave. So this is an imperative. Paul's talking about an unbeliever who deserts a believing spouse. He's not commanding it, but he's saying if the unbeliever leaves, let him leave. Occasionally, you also see imperatives used as greetings. When you have this, the normal force of the imperative is pretty well gone. This commanding idea, this imposition of will idea, is really pretty absent. Matthew 26:49, kai eutheos proselthon to Jesu apen, kaire, Rabbi. And immediately, going up to Jesus, he said, Kaire, Rabbi. Greetings, Rabbi. And the sad rest of the story is he kissed him and he betrayed him. Now for the optative mood. The optative mood expresses a wish or potentiality or possibility. It's not very frequent at all in the New Testament. Less than 70 times total. As we noted a moment ago, the subjunctive mood was encroaching upon the optative's territory, so you see a lot more subjunctives than you do optatives. I will point out a couple of uses of optatives. One is what we would call the volative optative. This would express a prayer, a blessing, a wish, or even an abhorrence. This is a word from the new Going Deeper with New Testament Greek. This chapter was written by Merkel. Others will call this the voluntative optative. Wallace uses that term. Charis humen kai erene plethun thee. So here's the optative. The idea here is may grace and peace be multiplied to you. May it happen. So this prayer, this blessing, this wish. A common abhorrence is this usage, me genita, by Paul. He does this a number of times. This is a verse we saw a moment ago. Hamartesumen, should we sin? Hati uk esmen hupa naman, al hupa karin. Should we sin because we're not under law, but we're under grace? And so Paul responds with this optative, expressing his abhorrence. By no means. May it never be. Absolutely not. And then the one other use of the optative I'll mention is the use of the optative in a conditional clause. The fulfillment of this condition is possible. It's further removed from reality than the subjunctive. So where the subjunctive was probable, the optative is one step further removed from that. It's not probable, but it's merely possible. 1 Peter 3:14, al e kai paskoite dia dikaiosunein makarioi. But even if you should suffer for righteousness, you are blessed. Basically, Peter's saying if you do right, very often people will treat you right. But if you do wrong, well, you're going to suffer consequences as doing wrong. But even if you should suffer for doing right, makarioi, you're blessed. So this is even further removed from reality. The normal rule, you do right, people treat you right, but not always. So here Peter uses an optative.